Welcome. I'm Professor Josh Klin from Vanderbilt University. Today we'll be talking about the Electoral College and how that affects presidential election contests. So to take a step back, elections in the United States are a combination of national laws and also state laws. And to think about the impacts of those, we're going to focus on three different aspects. First, what are some important rules that affect presidential elections and elections in general in the United States? Second, who is it that's making the rules? And so that allows us to understand why those rules exist and the consequences that they may have. And finally, what are some of the effects of those rules and the way that elections are being done in the United States? So importantly, we're not going to get into questions and debates about whether those rules are good or bad. Instead, we're going to focus on what the rules are and how they affect presidential elections in terms of who makes the rules and what consequences they have about how elections are being done. So the perspective we're going to adopt is trying to think seriously about where those rules are coming from. So the rules of the game matter a great deal, but they don't just come out of thin air. Instead, we need to think about the existence of those rules and how they come on in the context surrounding them. So in particular, we want to think about who are the participants that are involved in making the rules and what do they value? Second of all, how are they performing under the existing rules and norms? That is, are they benefiting? Are they behind and kind of put behind the eight ball a little bit? And finally, that's going to affect the type of rules that we see going forward. So understanding the rules of the game is important, but so is understanding the broader context. How did those rules come to be? How do they shape power in the existing system? And what implications are there going forward for potential reforms of those? So in the United States, our rules are governed by the Constitution. So let's go and see what the Constitution actually says about the elections as a starting point. So this is Article 1, Section 4, and this is talking about elections. And so as you can see, the rule says that all the elections shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, although Congress may overrule that. So the Constitution explicitly gives power to regulating elections to states and state legislatures, although it does give the proviso that the U.S. Congress can override those from time to time. So one example of the national government stepping in is the establishment of election day itself. So before it was the case, the state legislatures could determine when they wanted to appoint electors to the Electoral College, for example, or when they wanted to have their federal elections. But that was all standardized in 1845 by an act of Congress. So if you're wondering why we have election day on the first Tuesday of every November, it's because Congress decided to do so when they standardized it in 1845. So today, well, there's lots of different election laws that we might be interested in. Today, we're going to focus on how we choose our president. So the relevant statute in the Constitution is Article 2, Section 1. So this talks about how we're choosing the President of the United States, and in particular, it establishes the Electoral College. But before we get into the details of the Electoral College, it's useful to take a step back. So in particular, context is everything. So we're going to get in our time machine, our TARDIS because I'm a Doctor Who fan at this point, and we're going to go back to the Articles of Confederation and think about the context under which the Constitution came about, because that's going to explain in some part how we got the system that we have. So the Articles of Confederation, people sometimes forget about when they're outside of AP history classes, but this was the government that actually ruled the United States right after the Revolutionary War. And so in fact, from 1781 to 1789, the US government was a loose confederation of states. Now that detail matters because the power that the states experienced under the Articles of Confederation affected how much power they were willing to give to the new government under the US Constitution. So there's a lot of text here, but there's a couple of really important points that's worth pushing into, right, from Article 5. So first is noticed in the first paragraph in Article 5 that it notes that the legislature of each state shall direct to meet in Congress on the first Monday in November in every year with a power reserved to each state to recall its delegates or any of them at any time within the year and to send others in their stead for the remainder of the year. So that's a lot of technical jargon, but the essential point is that state legislatures under the Articles of Confederation were completely empowered to control their delegates. So again, there was no elections at all by the popular vote under the Articles of Confederation. Instead, every member to the Congress of Confederation was appointed by the state legislature. And in fact, it could be recalled at any point as well by the state legislature. Moreover, the second paragraph establishes not only term limits, but also the fact that Congress should have no less than 2, no more than 7 members. So the states were at liberty to decide how many delegates they wanted to send to the Congress of Confederation, and then moreover, that they were term limited, right? They can't serve for more than 396 years, and all the salaries were being paid by the states themselves. So again, not only was there term limits, but the salaries themselves of the members that were being sent by the state legislatures to the Congress was paid by the states. Again, if who pays your bills has power over you, This again reinforces the fact that state legislatures were the ones that were in charge, not the voters themselves. And finally, the last critical aspect is that even though they were going to individual members were going to the Congress of Confederation, they didn't have an individual vote. Instead, states voted by unit rule, which is the majority of the delegates from each state would determine how that state would vote. So again, really critical differences from what we think about the Congress today. So, how does that compare to what we have now? So recall, there's no chief executive, right? There was no president. Everything was done by the Congress. Moreover, the legislators were appointed, paid, and could be recalled by the state legislatures, right? Voters had no role in the process except insofar as they chose who represented them in the state legislature. States voted by unit rule. There was not any individual vote by members of Congress that were sent there by the state legislatures. Moreover, 9 out of the 13 states had to agree to do anything. And if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, it required unanimity. So this is context, and it seems a little detail-oriented, but it's really important for understanding how the Electoral College compares and how our present system compares, because this was the experience that members were operating under. And so as you can tell, the process is going to be hugely undemocratic, small d democratic. In particular, if you think about the allocation of political power in this system, it was advantaging the smaller states, a refrain you commonly hear. So if you think about 7 states who had less than 1/3 of the total population at the time, they had 7/13, so they have a majority voting power in the Articles of Confederation. Moreover, that small state of Rhode Island, who caused all kinds of difficulty for the Articles of Confederation because they had different economic interests than the others, they had 1/16 of the population of the states at that time, but they had 1/13 of the political power, so they had equal power. So if we think about how things were unequal now, back then it was even more so. Right? So this is the backdrop of which members, when they're trying to get together to figure out what the new Constitution would be, was looking like. So again, a very unequal system in terms of how the political power is being allocated, with smaller states being disproportionately affected and state legislatures having supreme power over what the Congress of Confederation was able to do. So this is the backdrop when we're thinking about the chief executive selection under the Constitution. So again, states were generally wary of centralized power. State legislatures in the Articles of Confederation were hugely powerful, right? So they're very wary of giving up any of that power to the new federal government, and certainly to a chief executive, which didn't even exist in the United States prior to the Constitution. Second of all, the states involved had very, very different interests. Issues of slavery, westward expansion, mercantilism, all meant that the states had very different views about what they wanted to do, and were very wary of being constrained in what they could do by other states involved. So we had competing interests, clashing interests, different points of views, and in a world in which you're wary of centralized power. Moreover, the existing rules under the Articles of Confederation greatly favor the state legislatures. So if you think about who holds the power right now, you have states with different interests. States are wielding all the power in the Articles of Confederation. And so you're thinking about making a move to some new system, that's going to constrain what's going to be possible. And finally, you need to get 9 states under the Constitutional Conventions to approve the new Constitution. So again, interesting aside is that even though the Constitution could be signed as an amendment of the Articles of Confederation, which would require unanimity, instead, in order to enact the Constitution, you need to get 9 constitutional conventions, right? Intentionally constitutional conventions, not state legislatures, note, to adopt the new Constitution itself. So put differently, the existing rules and who's favored by those existing rules is going to have a large constraint on what might be possible. So this is a rule not only for understanding where the Constitution came from and how we got the Electoral College, but more generally as we're going to talk about going forward. So what the rules are and who's favored by those rules is going to have a huge impact on the reforms that are possible. So let's dive in now. So that's by way of backdrop. So state legislature is really powerful, right? Different interests, very worried of centralized government, no experience with a chief executive. So along comes the Constitution, right? Trying to set up a new government and trying to figure out, well, if we're going to establish a chief executive, how are we going to select who that chief executive is going to be? Again, a completely new experience against the context and the backdrop of the states had under the Articles of Confederation. So this is Article 2, Section 1, that talks about how the president is going to be selected in the United States. And the second paragraph is key here, right? So again, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which a state may be entitled in the Congress. So critically, right, we're going to set up a new electors to select the president, it's going to be appointed by the states themselves. again, reflecting, right, the existence of the Articles of Confederation. There's no role for the voters here, right, in the Constitution. It's all given to the state legislatures. So that raises the question, though, you get as many as electors in each state as you have senators and representatives. So the number of senators was set at 2 by the Constitution. The number of electors by the House of Representatives was somewhat different. And in particular, here Article 1, Section 2 comes into place. And here you can see when they're determining the number of representatives in the House of Representatives and who is going to count as that is the critical aspect here. So the representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among several states, which may be included within this union according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service of a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So to backdrop, the state legislatures got to choose the electors to the Electoral College. How many electors did they get to do? Well, they had the 2 senators that each state was given under the Constitution, as well as the number of representatives to the House of Representatives. And the number of representatives that each state was given would vary across time, not only according to the population, but also according to Article 1, Section 2 that defined how people were counted under the Constitution. So this was a variable number, and so the number of representatives in the House of Representatives actually varied up until 1929 when the U.S. government decided to fix the number of representatives at 435. So again, how the political power was appointed depends very much on the context and who's in control of those processes. So again, this is the backdrop. We come from the Articles of Confederation, very strong state power, no chief executive. We have this new process that seems pretty undemocratic because it was intentionally undemocratic given the context, right? All the powers being given to the state legislatures to make that choosing. And so that was empowered to then choose the president through the institution of the Electoral College that was defined and left up to the states themselves to make that determination. So let's talk about the Electoral College. And the first question you have to ask yourself is, are we even in the right college, right? Because the Electoral College seems to be pretty powerful. You know, although a Vanderbilt degree is fantastic, a degree from the Electoral College would be even more powerful. So let's think about what the Electoral College is, because it's subject to a raging ongoing debate. So on the one hand, you have people thinking that it's a disaster for democracy. On the other hand, you have other people, and sometimes even the same person, thinking that's a fantastic aspect for democracy. So it's a raging debate, and we're not going to get into the pros and cons of the debate. We're just going to focus on what the rules are and the consequences of those rules. But it's a really interesting debate that I encourage you to think about on your own time to kind of figure out what you think about the Electoral College and its desirability. But one thing that is clear is that if you think about the public opinion on the issue, it says as follows. So here's the overall support from the Pew survey that's saying, well, if you think that how we should elect the president, right? So whether it should be chosen by popular vote, which is that whatever candidate gets the most number of votes should win, or should it be chosen using the Electoral College, right? Which is each state gets to determine the electors, the electors get together, and the president selected by the number of Electoral College votes that they receive. And so overall, you can see it's pretty stable since 2000, with 58% of the U.S. public thinking that the right way to choose the president of the United States is through popular vote, and 40% thinking that the Electoral College vote is how we should elect president. So again, a majority of the U.S. public currently think that the way we select our president under the Constitution should be reformed. But interestingly enough, or perhaps not so interesting given the times that we live in, is that you see huge differences by partisanship. So in particular, Democrats, 81% of those who either vote Democratic or lean Democratic think that we should select our president through popular vote. That's true as only 32% of Republicans. So although 58% of Americans polled think that the popular vote ought to be used, there's dramatic differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of what they believe. And hearkening back to how we opened the lecture, right, thinking about who's benefiting and who's not under current rules is really important for understanding the possibility of reforms going forward. So the fact that a partisan divide exists is going to be hugely consequential when we talk in a few minutes about potential reforms to the Electoral College system. So let's think about some of the effects that it has on how we choose our president. So first is that it means that there's unequal voting power. So what this graph shows you is it says that how many individuals is equivalent to each Electoral College vote. So recall that each state gets 2 Electoral College votes because there's 2 senators, and an additional number according to the number of representatives it has. So Wyoming, for example, right, gets 2 plus 1 representative for a total of 3. So given the population of Wyoming, that means that each elector in Wyoming is equivalent to roughly 200,000 individuals. In California, however, that number is closer to 700,000. So the rules that we have, and in particular the fact that each state gets 2 senators, and the number of senators helps determine the number of electors, means that there's very unequal voting power among individuals across the states. Now, this is a problem, potentially, but also revealed as exactly what was true under the Articles of Confederation, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, the tiny state of Rhode Island, right, with 1/60 of the population, had equal voting shares with Virginia and New York. So again, there's unequal voting power, but it's not different from what was existing in the prior period. So again, you may think this is a problem, but it's consistent with the context under which the rules were developed. A second effect of the Electoral College voting is it can tend to inflate the margins of winning candidates. So because our states typically choose a winner-take-all system, which is that whatever candidate wins a majority of votes in that state, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska right now, gets all the Electoral College votes, that can take narrow victories in the popular vote and magnify those. So this shows across time from 1828 how the popular vote that a candidate receives compares to the Electoral College vote that candidate receives. And what you can see is the popular vote that candidates receive is typically around 50%. But the Electoral College vote that candidate gets is roughly around 75%. So what this is showing you is how the popular vote margin compares to the Electoral College vote margin. And what you can see is the Electoral College vote, because it's a winner-take-all system, except in Maine and Nebraska, can exacerbate or amplify how much a candidate wins by. So consider, for example, 1936, right? So here's an example where FDR got 60% of the popular vote, but nearly 100% Electoral College votes, a 40-point shift. So even though a candidate may be picking up votes, because they don't get Electoral College votes unless they win the state, given how states have chosen to allocate their electors, right? That can mean that close elections in the popular vote turn out to blowouts in terms of Electoral College votes. So one thing about the Electoral College vote is it typically produces more resolute outcomes, which means that the winning Electoral College vote is getting a larger share of Electoral College votes than they do in the popular vote. But of course, that's not always the case, right? You also get the possibility that a candidate could lose the popular vote, as we saw in 2016, and 4 times earlier than that, but nonetheless win the presidency because of how they performed the Electoral College votes. So for example, in 2016, President Trump got 46.1% of the popular vote, right? Losing to Secretary Clinton by 2.1% in the popular vote, but nonetheless received 56.5% Electoral College votes, right? And you can go down the line, President Bush in 2000, President Harris in 1888, President Hayes in 1876, and then President Adams in 1824, which is a really wonky election, where Adams only got 30.9% of the popular vote and 32.2% of the Electoral College vote, but nonetheless ended up being nominated president as a result of kind of all the post-election activities that occurred there. So again, here's an example that even though the Electoral College makes our outcomes more resolute because of how we decide to allocate the electors at the state level, it's also possible, given the rules of the game, that a candidate can lose the popular vote, but nonetheless win the presidency by winning the Electoral College votes. Running up the score in a state like New York or California, for example, doesn't really help a candidate because they get the same number of Electoral College votes regardless of the margin. Whoever gets above 50, once it's winner take all, gets all the Electoral College votes. So that's some consequences that we've seen of the Electoral College votes in terms of how it makes it for disproportionate voting power by individuals. So if you live in Wyoming, your vote in some sense counts more than it does in California, given the relationship between electors to population. We also see that sometimes it makes for more resolute elections because it takes popular votes. In general, it results in greater margins of Electoral College votes than the popular vote. But nonetheless, it's also possible to lose the popular vote, but win the Electoral College vote, depending on how your support is allocated across the states, given the representation of states in Electoral College votes. So that may be good, that may be bad, depending on your persuasions. But let's take a step back a little bit to think about why this was chosen again. Right? So because that's different, right? It's not just a popular vote. Even though Americans think it should be a popular vote, especially if you're a Democrat, not so much if you're a Republican. So it's worth reminding ourselves the reasons why the Electoral College was chosen in the first place. So one thing to highlight though, right, is that we sometimes lose track of is that the existence of a chief executive in the first place is a remarkable change over what the Articles of Confederation were. So AOC, there's Articles of Confederation, not the representative from New York. But anyway, right? So again, Articles of Confederation, no chief executive. We now have a chief executive elected by Electoral College vote. So that in and of itself is a huge contribution, right? And it's a huge change relative to what the context was. So let's think about what some explanations or accounts were given as to why we have Electoral College votes. So the Federalist Papers were written by individuals trying to convince the New York State Constitutional Convention to adopt the Constitution. So in some sense, they were one of the first political ads or political arguments being made on behalf of the U.S. Constitution. So here's Alexander Hamilton writing in Federalist 68, talking about why he thinks the Electoral College is such a good aspect, right? And so as you can see, that one of the explanations were not exactly small d democratic. So in particular, he says it was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men, intentionally men, most capable of analyzing the qualities adopted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. In other words, they want to have a very small number of individuals who they thought were being more qualified than the average individual. And again, at the time, so they're thinking about select individual elites, such as themselves, who would be empowered to choose the president because they would be both able to analyze the qualities adapted to the station in their perspective. So again, there's no rule that was originally made to the voters. In fact, they thought it should be made by a small group of individuals getting together. So here's the justification of what Hamilton thinks the consequences of that selection will be. So it's worth reading and coming to your own conclusions. The process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Talent for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union, or of so considerable a portion of it as it would be necessary to make him a successful candidate for the distinguished office of the President of the United States. It will not be too strong to say that there will be a constant probability of seeing the station filled by characters preeminent for ability and virtue. Again, it's a strong statement that the thought was that let's select a small number of individuals, empower them entirely to choose the president, and the thought was that process itself would help select the best candidates and their particular views. So again, not democratic at all, right? There's no role for the popular vote here. In fact, there's not even any role for the state legislatures here. Right? It was thought that they would select these individuals, they get together like a jury in some sense, and then select who the president would be. It's again worthwhile thinking about that was the process they had in their mind when thinking about what the Electoral College is doing and the consequences thereof. So there's lots of debate, right, given the circumstances and a lot of unhappiness by some individuals, particularly among Democrats. So let's talk about those. Let's talk about the possibility of reforming the Electoral College and what that might look like. So to take a step back, though, to get there, right, it's important to kind of think about the process of electing the president by electors themselves. So again, recall that what happens on Election Day right now is that the states vote, right, so we have a vote on Election Day. From that, then, the state selects electors that are going to then meet and kind of choose the president. So the question then becomes is like, what binds that elector who's selected to cast their vote for the candidate that the state vote for? And in reality, there's nothing, right? There's nothing at the federal level that establishes that. So what some states have done, because again, all rules governing elections that are not taken over by the federal government are left to the state governments, what some states governments have done is they've gone forward and they've passed laws called Faithless elector laws, which is that if you're appointed to the Electoral College and you vote differently than the way that you ought to according to the popular vote, then we're going to punish you, typically by a small fine. So for example, Oklahoma and Washington impose a civil penalty of $1,000, and North Carolina charges you $500. So if you get appointed to be an elector and you show up and you vote for the wrong candidate, you're going to get a fine.
I want to get right to this. A Supreme Court decision just out. Shannon Bream is standing by on the breaking news for us. As expected, we're starting to get some rulings from the Supreme Court. Our chief legal correspondent, anchor of the Fox News at Night, Shannon Bream. Shannon, what do you have? Good morning.
Yeah, Sandra, I'm reading right now. We have a pair of cases that involve faithless electors, people who are pledged and chosen by their states to go to the Electoral College and vote based on how the state basically tells them to vote, how the popular vote went down. There were a group of voters from Washington state. There was another in Colorado who both challenged this last time around, saying, I want to be able to, and I have the freedom and the right to, when I get to that vote for the Electoral College that they do after the popular vote all across the country, I want to vote how I want to. And the state said no. In some states, you can fine or sanction people. There are other remedies and methods for stopping them from doing what they do or punishing them if they do that. Today, in a unanimous opinion, the Supreme Court has said no. If you are an elector, you're chosen by your state, you got to follow the rules. It was one of those arguments. It was one of the first that they did by teleconference over the phone. And across the board, we uniformly heard them saying, I don't understand how this would work. There would be chaotic. There were questions raised about bribes. What if somebody started bribing electors? If you only have a swing of 5 to 10 electors who decide to do their own thing, that can actually change an election in a very tight year. So Justice Kagan writes for the majority here, and she says, among the devices states have long used to achieve their objective are these pledge laws designed to impress on electors their roles as agents of others. A state follows the same tradition if, like Washington, which was one of the states in these cases, it chooses to sanction an elector for breaching his promise. Then, too, the state instructs its electors they have no ground for reversing the vote of millions of its citizens. She says that direction accords with the Constitution as well as with the trust of a nation that here we, the people, rule. So they said, listen, these states got it right. If you have an elector who goes to the Electoral College, you can bind them as a state to vote the way that they said they would, which is based on your state's popular vote. And sometimes they do split. Occasionally there are a couple of states that will split off how the electors go or how their popular vote goes. But the bottom line is here, the courts agreed on this one. And Sandra, we don't often see 9-0 opinions these days.
Okay, Shannon Bream on that for us.
So this came to head this year in 2020. So in Chaffo versus Washington, what happened is that there were 3 electors from the 2016 election from Washington state that were supposed to vote for Secretary Clinton in the Electoral College, but they chose not to do so. So again, Washington state voted for Secretary Clinton. 3 electors were chosen by the state as a result of that vote. Each were fined $1,000, and then they took it to the Supreme Court and said, does the state have the power to write these rules to enforce what electors ought to do or not? So in that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that states have complete power to control what their electors do. And in fact, they say the Constitution is bare bones about electors, right? We already saw the entire text that the Constitution talks about electors, and there's not much there, right? So the Supreme Court recognized that and said that Article 2 includes only instruction to each state to appoint, in whatever way it likes, its presidential electors. So again, what the Supreme Court said is that the state is within its power to punish faithless electors. Right? So again, the electors that are chosen to elect the president as a result of what happens on Election Day, the Supreme Court recently held in 2020 that the state is within its power to mandate and to kind of punish electors who vote contrary to the rules that it gives it. Right? So again, very different from the process of deliberation that Alexander Hamilton imagined in Federalist 68. Instead, it's much more mechanical nowadays, where the state legislatures determine the rules and what its electors are supposed to do, and the electors are there just to carry it out. There's no deliberation, there's no talking. Well, there's talking, but there's just they get together and they cast their ballot. It's very different from the process that was originally intended, or kind of thought, at least intended by Hamilton when the Constitution was adopted.
Just months before the presidential election, the U.S. Supreme Court is telling electors in the Electoral College who determine the ultimate winner that they can't go rogue and not vote for the candidate who wins the state's popular vote. The decision essentially blocks a handful of would-be independent-minded members from deciding the next president. State officials have said these so-called faithless electors threaten the integrity of American democracy by undermining the will of the electorate and opening the door to corruption. But the plaintiffs in the case said the Constitution requires them to exercise independent judgment to prevent unfit candidates from taking office. The justices on Monday unanimously ruled in favor of Washington State and Colorado, which had imposed $1,000 penalties on several faithless electors who defied pledges in 2016 to vote for the winner of their state's popular vote, Democrat Hillary Clinton. Republican President Donald Trump defeated Clinton by a margin of 304 to 227 Electoral College votes, despite losing the popular vote nationally by about 3 million votes. In 2016, 10 of the 538 electors cast ballots for someone other than their state's popular vote winner, an unusually high number that could have changed the outcome of 5 of the 58 previous U.S. presidential elections.
So this is important not only because it talks about the faithless electors, but because of what it implies about potential reforms. So clearly, one way we can get a reform is to abolish the Electoral College, right, the Constitution. So there's two ways that can happen. The first is that Congress can propose an amendment, right? So we can have a constitutional amendment that rewrites the Constitution and strips out the Electoral College and makes it by popular vote. But let's think about the rules that are required to do that. So that requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and also has to be ratified by state legislatures in 3/4 of the states. Hugely high bar. Right? Hugely high bar. So the last constitutional amendment was basically lowering the voting age to 18th, the 26th Amendment. But if you think about the political power nowadays, the likelihood that 3/4 of the state legislatures are going to approve of that is pretty low, especially because we already know that some of those state legislatures are empowered by, right, the existing laws in Electoral College votes. Right? So if you're a state legislator for Wyoming, you're loving the fact that you have lots more political power than you would under the popular vote. So just thinking about the context and who holds the political power suggests that this is unlikely to occur. The second possibility is that we could have a new constitutional convention, right? So we get together in Philadelphia or Disney World or wherever they want to hold their meetings nowadays, and if 2/3 of the states can petition Congress to convene a constitutional convention. So this method has never been invoked, and it seems very unlikely, because once we enter into a constitutional convention, then everything's on the table. Right? It's not just the Electoral College, but every single aspect of the Constitution could be rethought and redone. So these are the two methods, and both seem very, very unlikely. So again, it seems unlikely we're going to have a constitutional amendment, given that the requirements means that some people who are currently benefiting from that system would have to vote to abolish it. And a constitutional convention seems very unlikely because that opens the door to make changes on the entire Constitution, right? Not just limited to the Electoral College. Again, people may be very reluctant to do so, given the existing status quo, so that also seems unlikely. So what has happened is that recall that each state has the ability to appoint its own electors. And so this has led to a movement among some states, which is called the National Popular Vote Compact, which is that a compact that a group of states have gotten together and saying that if we meet circumstances, we'll define conditions about how our electors will vote. So particularly the idea is this, is that if enough states agree to cast their electors for the winner of the popular vote, then that effectively makes the Electoral College vote reflect the popular vote winning. So in particular, if states worth 270 Electoral College votes all decide to agree that they will cast all the Electoral College votes for whoever wins the popular vote, then effectively you've abolished the Electoral College. And so it's using the power within the Constitution that's given to each state legislature to define how their electors are chosen and what their electors are supposed to do, right? Power that was reestablished by Chaffel et al. Versus Washington, right? The Faithless elector case that we just talked about. It's possible that if there's states with 270 Electoral College votes or more, they all decide that this is what they're going to instruct their electors to do, then effectively those states can enact a popular vote via the Electoral College votes. So it's a very clever idea that doesn't require amending the Constitution or having a constitutional convention, but relies upon the pre-existing powers in the Constitution that give states the power to decide how their electors are going to vote. So again, if states worth 270 Electoral College votes all decide to instruct their electors to vote for the winner of the popular vote, that effectively makes the Electoral College choose whoever wins the popular vote. So let's see how that looks. So this is a horrible color scheme, right, that's showing the current status of where the National Popular Vote Compact is. And what you can see is that 100 states worth 196 Electoral College votes have already signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact. So again, when this number hits 270, right, so when you get 270 Electoral College votes, then the compact takes effect. Until that point, states are free to do whatever they want. So the critical question, if you want to reform the Electoral College votes, is how likely is it that this 196 Electoral College votes can get up to 270, right? Because when it hits 270, that's when the laws that were adopted by these states would kick into place. So if you step back here, you can see that California, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Massachusetts, they've all already adopted and signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact. They were just waiting for enough states to sign on to hit 270. So that raises the question then, how likely is it that we're going to get to 270? So here's a list of states that had some action in their state legislatures to adopt the state National Popular Vote Compact, the number of Electoral College votes that they have, and then using the Cook Partisan Voting Index, how Republican or Democratic leaning those states are. So you can see that the state with the most Electoral College votes that is yet to act on the National Popular Vote Compact is Florida, and currently that state leads Republican. Pennsylvania with 20 Electoral College votes is even. Ohio with 18 is Republican +3. Georgia 16, Republican +5. North Carolina 15, R +3, Republican +3. Virginia 13 Electoral College votes, Democrat +1, and kind of so forth. So you can see the states that lean Republican, states that lean Democrat, and then states that are really closely contested. And so the math you have to do in your head is that we have 196 votes if you're for the National Popular Vote Compact. How do we get to 270? What's our path? So let's just kind of walk through that. So if you add up all the Democratic leaning states, right? So that's Virginia, Minnesota, and Maine, according to the Cook Political Voting Index, that gets you 27. Not going to do it. Now let's suppose you can get all the even states as well. So Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire. That gets you 34. So a grand total of 61. 61, last time I checked, was not equal to 74. So you're still short. So then the question is, which of these Republican-leaning states can you pick up? So again, this isn't saying whether the National Popular Vote Compact is good or bad, but just saying this is the reality on the ground, that if you want to get to 270, which states are you going to be able to pick up? And in particular, which Republican-leaning states would want to go for a popular vote method rather than using the existing Electoral College vote? And given the partisan split we saw in public opinion, right, that seems unlikely. So again, understand the context, who has power now and who's favored by those systems and who's going to be favored by the reforms is really important for understanding the potential for reforms to occur. So again, that's the National Popular Vote Compact. And the critical question is, how do you get from 196 to 270, and which states is it going to go through, right? And who's going to make that decision? So again, we'll see, and left up to there, but that's a little bit of background information there. So what else could states do? So recall that the Constitution gives all the power to state legislatures to do whatever they want with their electors. So typically what we do, right, except for Maine and Nebraska, is we do winner take all. So whatever candidate gets the plurality of the vote gets all the state's Electoral College votes. So that has a consequence of magnifying margins. So we saw earlier that small popular vote margins can get exacerbated to massive Electoral College blowouts, right? But it doesn't have to be the case, right? States are free to do whatever method they want within their state legislature to change how electors are chosen. So for example, you could have a congressional district popular vote, right? So one possibility is that each state gives 2 Electoral College votes to the popular vote winner of each state, and then district by district, you get whoever wins that district gets the Electoral College vote from that district. So this is what Maine and Nebraska do, right? Whoever wins the state of Maine, right, popular vote gets 2 Electoral College votes, and then they go district by district in Maine, and whoever wins each district gets an additional elector. So again, it doesn't make it winner take all, it makes things a little bit more vary across congressional districts. Alternatively, you could do that for the entire state, right? You could just have whoever wins a majority of congressional districts gets all of the votes, or you can do the proportional popular vote based on congressional district or not. Right? So there's lots of different ways that you can think of about how you could devise a system that's completely under the control of the state, right? So each state is given the ability to do whatever it wants in terms of how its electors are being chosen. So there's lots of different alternatives you can think about, and we can also walk through what the consequences of those different choices are in terms of the overall popular vote, in terms of the overall Electoral College vote, and how the popular vote maps into that. So for example, here's our current system, right? A very bland beigey color, right? Because every state is using the winner-take-all system, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska. So if you think about how that translated into Electoral College votes, right? President Trump got 306 Electoral College votes. Secretary Clinton got 232. So that's status quo. So we can think about, what if states did something differently, right? And what if all states did something differently? And so this is where it becomes fun, right? So you can imagine, what if instead of doing a winner-take-all for states, states went district by district and decided who won and allocated Electoral College votes based on the number of CDs that were won. So this is, again, what Maine and Nebraska currently do, but here you get a different map. right? So now Clinton has 248 Electoral College votes, and President Trump has 290. So this results in cases for like California, instead of the Secretary Glenn getting all the Electoral College votes, now President Trump will get 7 from California, right? Because there are 7 districts in California that he won votes in. So a different way of aggregating with different results. Or we could do, instead of doing by congressional district, we could just by proportion of the popular vote, right? So we try to like allocate Electoral College votes from that state in best we can to match the proportion of the popular vote the candidates receive. I'd say here we'd have a much closer election, right? Secretary Clinton, we got 265 votes, and President Trump will get 267. Again, it wouldn't have Secretary Clinton the lead because of how it's been apportioned with the 2 votes for every senator, but nonetheless, that makes it more reflective of the popular vote winner. So again, these are all possible because the states themselves determine what rules they're going to use. And you can even go bonkers and figure out what's the optimal plan if you're a Republican, or what's the optimal plan if you're a Democrat to maximize the number of Electoral College votes. So the overall point is that the rules of the game matter tremendously. And it's up to the states themselves to figure out how they're going to allocate those electors. And the decisions that they're making is not made without context, right? They're thinking about who holds power now and how does any reform affect the composition and the balance of power within that state. Really critical. So it's not a normative argument, but just a statement of this is what political power on the ground is. And thinking about context and reforms, it's important to contextualize and account for how that can affect the plausibility of reforms. So the big takeaway, right? So Electoral College is important because rules matter. Right? We need to understand the context. So understanding the Articles of Confederation and how that shaped political power within that system, I think is essential for understanding how the Constitution came to be and how the Constitution allocated power. Right? We go from a world in which no chief executive, lots of power in state legislatures, to a world in which we have chief executive, but power is still not democratic in the way we think of contemporaneously, but a lot of power still given to state legislatures. And then we think about today, right? If you're not happy with the outcome of the Electoral College vote, right? Thinking about who controls power now is absolutely essential for understanding what the prospects for reform going forward are, right? And the likelihood that people are willing to kind of take actions that either advantage or disadvantage themselves, given their positions and given the rules of the game that we're currently operating under. So finally, right? Thinking in all terms about who are the participants and what do they value? Right? How do existing rules and norms affect those relationships? And how would the proposed rules change that are critically essential for you to be an intelligent consumer about understanding the rules of the game that we have now. So you can argue about whether the Electoral College is good or bad, right? And those are really important, very valuable debates. But again, what I want you to think about is how do we come to have the Electoral College? What are the consequences of shaping the rules of the game that we have existingly? And then given that allocation of political power that exists right now, given those rules, what are the prospects of reform going forward, right? So the question of whether it's good or bad is an important point, but not one that is directly relevant for understanding what those rules are and how those rules shape the elections that we have going forward. So thanks so much for your time. And again, Electoral College, really critically important, also complicated, may not be what you think of if you sit down at a blank sheet of paper and write up what the rules for selecting a president are, but understanding the process by which it came to be and the context in which it was written and kind of going forward, I think is absolutely essential for giving insights as to better explaining why it takes the form that it does, regardless of whether or not it's good or bad in your particular eyes. So thanks so much for listening and have a great day.